and Mahmoud,
Mahmoud.
the Ansari podcast.
Yeah.
I'm happy to be here.
Thanks for coming, man.
Thank you.
Moses the comic. Thank you for coming, man.
Writer, professor, actor,
I was just thinking.
business owner, philanthropist, if you will.
I was just thinking I should have written down what you do so I could do the whole introduction. But you do a lot of things, man. MashaAllah, Allahumma barik. May Allah bless you more and more.
It's a beautiful setup, everything that you're doing. I've been following the podcast for all 50 episodes. Okay. All 50 I've seen. And this is the 51st. So I'm happy to be here.
Thank you for coming, man. I appreciate you. So we were talking before we even started recording about the work we're trying to do and some of the goals that we're trying to accomplish as Muslims and as you as a Muslim African American growing up in this country. But I'd love to hear a little bit about your background.
And what is your background?
I'm Egyptian.
You're Egyptian, so you had a completely different upbringing culturally than I did. I'm born and raised in Philadelphia. We're in the city of brotherly love here,
Well, my parents are from Egypt.
They're from Egypt.
I was born in Maryland. But yeah, exactly. I have a completely
but culturally,
different,
that's what I mean. Culturally, you had a completely different upbringing. Environmentally, we could have grown up even on the same block and had two different upbringings, culturally, right? And so I was always interested in that aspect of our identities, how sometimes we're identified by our cultures and what we're exposed to. So, I grew up in a black Muslim household. My parents were born and raised Christian, but converted, and were a part of that first kind of the establishment of black Islam and Islam in Philadelphia.
What made your parents convert?
You said when?
What made them?
I guess it's so fascinating. I was talking to someone today actually about, that journey of course we know Allah put Islam in our heart, but kind of like, what did it for them. And my father's backstory is kind of, some, I guess, stereotypical, quintessential, and some just like, I'm going to write a movie on my dad one day, first and foremost. Wow. My dad passed in 2010, may Allah be pleased with him. Right. But my father, was like one of 10 children, grew up, born in 1945, impoverished communities and one of 10 children. It wasn't much to do back then. Kids were outside, growing up, even in my generation, we played outside. Everything wasn't inside on the computers. And my father went from, as a teenager, went to Vietnam, got drafted into the services. It wasn't a lot of opportunities, for black, men at that time. So he went to the services, and he was a Marine. He went to Vietnam, Purple Heart recipient, honorable discharge, the whole 9 yards, got out of the war, and just, there wasn't a lot of opportunities for veterans at that time like it is today, especially not for black ones. So he wound up, he was a knucklehead just before he was Muslim. And, he was just doing crime and stuff and wound up in prison. And in prison, he got exposed to Islam, which a lot of, men did. That was the stereotype, of course, in the 80s where, you were exposed to Islam in prison, which he was. And his cellmate at the time was a cousin of my mother. And on a different path was my mother growing up in New Jersey. And
she converted on her own?
She converted on her own. Yeah. Wow. Through being exposed to Islam. And my mother and father met as pen pals. From my father being in prison and with her cousin who was like, well, I have a cousin who's looking to, get married or what have you. And their first interaction was through writing letters to each other as pen pals. And from then, my father, he came home and they started a family. So we grew up, in Philadelphia in a very black Muslim community. And why I say that we had different upbringings is because, which led me to later in life really wanting to research how Islam was introduced to black people, because Islam at one point in America, the only identity of Islam was through black Muslims. And so Islam was like very strict for me growing up. We lived in communities where, it wasn't, the black Muslims really cleaned the communities up. There was no drugs and, there was no, alcohol. There was no abuse. There was no like domestic abuse going on in the homes. This was like stuff that was like vehemently kind of against, even during the Nation of Islam, when that was like the identity of Islam in America at one point, it was very disciplined. Where you see certain cultures where that stuff is prevalent. You have domestic abuse, you have sexual abuse, there's even certain Muslims around the world that celebrate certain holidays, that may celebrate Christmas or Halloween or what have you. So, I grew up in a pretty strict Muslim environment where, You know, it was like you know, by
It's
the book.
not even strict, man.
You're not even strict, right? When you say it, it shouldn't be strict. It's
not
like
strict.
that's
That's
Islam. I grew up. You're right. I grew up in an Islamic environment, the way in which the Islam, you know, we were, you know, indoctrinated with. This is how you practice Islam. You don't do things as a Muslims. We have a certain standard, you know, of how
what's
we are.
interesting about what you're saying is that sounds beautiful. You said like it cleaned up so many things that it's very difficult. Cops can't even. The government that claims to be the most powerful in the world can't even do what Islam has done in the communities that you're citing. One of the things that I find so fascinating is when the government tells us what to do and puts in laws and is strict on us, and this government's one of the strictest, right? We have some of the highest population of adults in prisons, over 1%, right? To that's law and order, and people love law and order. There's literally a show called Law and Order. So they model.
We're obsessed with it in America.
Yeah, exactly.
With the idea of it.
So when a government instills laws on us, we call it law and order, and we fantasize about it and love it. But then when Allah does it, when God does it, it's called strict. When what He's doing is actually cleaning up our neighborhoods, when the government is even doing that. So when people always say, "Oh, you're a conservative Muslim," or "Oh, you're a religious Muslim," "Oh, you're a strict Muslim," no, I'm a Muslim, right? Like that's what a Muslim is. A Muslim is someone who's submitted. What do you mean? I'm not going to harass. I'm not going to domestically abuse. That's not what a Muslim does.
I think we got so far away from that too. I talk about that in some of my lectures as well, where the biggest thing, I think one of the biggest gripes for our generation, I don't know how old you are, but we're a generation or two or within the same kind of realm of generation, is our prayers. And our prayers, one of the reasons is that, and I use always the analogy of money, because Islam is wealth. That's true wealth, right? Is a child being born into money versus someone having to work hard for it when you get it from the mud, right? There's a different appreciation for it. And for us, our Islam, for my generation, we inherited Islam. We didn't establish it. We didn't get it from the mud like the generation before us, our fathers, our grandfathers, our grandparents that, during a time when it was taboo to be Muslim, they were unapologetically Muslim when it wasn't cool to be. It's cool to be Muslim now. Everybody wear a kufi, everybody wear hijab. It's like, but during a time where just like where it's cool to be black now, we live in a society where Black Panthers, and it's like, but there was a time where that wasn't cool. You know what I mean? It was derogatory. It was sensitive. It was salacious. And so it's interesting that what my father and what they really, what prayer specifically is that like they established salat. Where like with money, for example, it was just given to us. And so when I think about my father and how important it was to him, because it's like, we're going to make a presence for this in the world. So I grew up where that was just the identity that I saw visually from my father. My father was unapologetically Muslim. Like he was the epicenter, the example of Islam in our family, hence our community. So he was a part of like one of the pioneering Muslims, where when you think about maybe how you grew up in your Egyptian communities, where there were certain uncles and certain aunties where these were of the community type. So my father he was that. No matter where he went, it was salamu alaikum. He answered his phone, no matter who was on the other end of that phone, salamu alaikum. He's, wearing thobes in the airport. Like we grew up, and this is in the 90s, where if salat came in and we was on the train, my father, we're making salat on the L platform. He's not missing prayer. Nice. I grew up in, so which that was Islam. It was just that this is my belief. To you be your way, to me be mine. And this room that we sitting in, a lot of the people up on the walls that we're inspired from, the Malcolm X's of the world, the Muhammad Ali's, the examples of the Black Muslims that stood for what they believe. And so that was kind of like indoctrinated in me growing up in Philadelphia, and then subsequently led me into a comedic path as well.